People up here, I'll be back. I have a hard time staying up there. We come back here with the Torahs, but I like to also just make sure that this group in the back is included. So I want to start with a question, and I really hope that you'll save me and be one of the first to answer. One of my teachers once asked the question, why don't we do Yom Kippur first? And then we could go into the new year on a clean slate. And the answer that he gave, of course, is that we can't really have Yom Kippur, we can't really atone for our sins from the year which has passed unless we regain a vision of what the world should be, of who we should be, of the ideal. So here's my question. You can close your eyes to think about this, or you don't have to. We'll do more of that on Yom Kippur. What is an ideal Jewish moment? What does it look like if you're making a movie of it? Give me an example, maybe from your own lives, of an ideal Jewish moment. I really am hoping that somebody will save me here in the back, because this is one of those questions, again, not that I'm asking and answering, but that I want you to help me. Yeah, Sally. Sally said an ideal Jewish moment would be family gathered around the table. Challah, flowers, candles. What else? Yeah, Alice. Alice said it was when we walked our grandson in for his Brit Milah. It may not have been an ideal Jewish moment for him, but when we brought him in, yes. Yeah. When we reach out to someone in need. When we reach out to someone who is in need. One more? Tobin.
Seeing my children up on the bima.
Ooh. Tobin said seeing her children up on the bima, engaged in tefillah, praying with her classmates. All right, I'll take a couple of answers from up here too. Yes?
Last Shabbos, we had an ideal Jewish moment. My 93-year-old cousin is a Holocaust survivor, read in the Torah as his fourth grandson's bar mitzvah. Joy, all love, no anger.
Pure joy, all love, no anger. 93-year-old grandfather who was a Holocaust survivor reads from the Torah at the bar mitzvah of his fourth grandchild. It's a good moment. Yeah, Leslie. When we take our Jewish values out into whatever we do in the world. So I ask this question because I want to focus today on our sixth sense. In his book, Everything is Illuminated, Jonathan Safran Foer wrote, Jews have six senses, and you have them on your card. Touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, memory. While others may experience and process the world through the traditional senses, he writes, and use memory as a second-order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin, or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. And I want to point this out because I don't think everyone experiences the world this way. In Leo Tolstoy's short story, The Emperor's Three Questions, he writes, there is only one important time, and that is now. The present moment is the only time over which we have dominion. The most important person is always the person you are with, who is right before you, for who knows if you will have dealings with any other person in the future. And the most important pursuit is making the person standing at your side happy, for that alone is the pursuit of life. And I'm not sure Judaism agrees. Don't get me wrong, part of what religions try to do, and certainly Judaism as well, is to live in the moment, to be present for our lives. I have given sermons about this, about how Judaism too tries to help us to do this, to say a bracha before we eat in order to bring our consciousness to the long chain of events that it takes to bring food to our table. To awaken each day with gratitude, but I'm not convinced that the Jewish ideal is living only in the moment. We live with 6 senses. This year, perhaps more than other years, I have craved to live with memory. When my father died in November, I felt exposed. I felt like a hole in the ozone layer had opened, leaving me closer to the vacuum of space, like it was harder to breathe. My father was alive during the Depression and World War II. He told me about how his father, my grandfather, fought in World War I, and when he was 5 years old, saw in-person Buffalo Bill in a parade in Cody, Wyoming. When my dad died, it felt like my access to history had been shortened. When he was alive, I think I felt a sense of pride in being connected to his life. He once met Albert Einstein. After World War II, he and a few other engineers were tasked with developing a way for the U.S. to monitor whether the Soviets had tested an atomic bomb. There were no satellites. There were no other people in some room working on that. It was just my dad and a few engineers who sat down in a room, thought about it for a while, and figured out that if they could place some sort of sensor on a few mountains somewhere in the world, that they would know. Through my father, I was connected to history, to this other time. It's true, I still have his life. I have stories, but in losing him, I lost first-person access. This Shabbat we will read Sha'al Avicha v'yagedcha zikanecha v'yomru lach. Inquire of generations gone by, they will tell you. Ask your parents and they will inform you. But if I have a question about what came before, I can't go to my father anymore. There will be no newness about what he can teach me about my past. Living just in the present doesn't feel perfect. I don't want to be just in this moment. I want to be many moments. I want to feel with 6 senses. I think the ideal Jewish moment is not quiet and alone, but as we heard, it's noisy. It's crowded. There are other people there. Today, we heard the shofar. We will hear it again. When we hear that shofar, and it was blown so beautifully, but when we hear that shofar, we don't just hear one shofar. In our shofar, we hear other shofars of Jews around the world and of Jews throughout the generations who have gathered on this day to sound the shofar. Bethel on Rosh HaShanah is a wonderful place. Part of its greatness is that this room, this community is steeped in memory. of people who are here and remember, of people whose spirit we feel. This is our last Rosh HaShanah, most likely. It's up to you. With the room configured just like this. Next year, Mirz Hashem, God willing, we will be in the Carolina Theater. And the year after, we'll be facing, well, the Ark will be over there. East. A novel concept. And the memorial boards will be there. A very fitting place for the memorial boards and a fitting use of the Ark. We will soon be the ones whose memories reach back to today. We'll say, oh, I remember when we used to face south. Why do we do that? I don't know. We will be the ones whose memories reach back to today. It will feel good to remember and feel good to be remembered. "2017 has been a year of memory, not only for me because my father died, and I admit perhaps one can do this with many dates in history, but it struck me that 2017 is a year that actually echoes with modern Jewish history. 2017 is 120 years since the first Zionist Congress in 1897, when the dream of modern Israel was born. 2017 is 100 years since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the right of Jews to a national home was first recognized by international law. 2017 is 70 years since 1947. To really know the story of a place, you have to know the dates that they name streets after. And in Jerusalem, you can go to Jerusalem, and in the neighborhood Katamon, there is a street called Kaftet bin November, the 29th of November, because it was on November 29th in 1947 that the United Nations General Assembly voted 33-13 in favor of a resolution which adopted a plan for the partition of Palestine to include a Jewish state. And 2017 is 50 years since the Six-Day War in 67, when Israel was threatened with annihilation by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, and not only survived, but conquered Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And since Israel began its domination of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza, without giving them a voice in Israel's democratically elected parliament. Over the summer, I had lunch with Ivy Wingate. She knows I'm going to tell about this. We've both been in mourning this year. And at the end of the lunch, she asked me a question. She said, "What is a gift your father gave you that you want to remember?" And I told her that my father gave to me a sense of confidence that I could do anything. But that constant encourage, you could start a business, you can write a book, you can run for office, had an edge to it. It came with the sense that maybe whatever I did wasn't enough. As Ivy and I said goodbye, she gave to her rabbi a blessing. She said, "I bless you that as the years go by, you will only remember the sweetness." And I am grateful for her blessing, and I accept it, and I'm not sure I agree. Remembering is, by its very nature, partial. It is remembering, reconstructing parts into a whole that is coherent, but cannot ever be what was. But the type of memory that I crave is the whole thing, the whole person, the whole place. We are here on the high holidays to reflect on what is timeless, not just timely. The significance of Israel for modern Jewish identity lies far beyond a particular policy or government. Israel is the most audacious project of the Jewish people since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. And it deeply impacts Jewishness in our time. While the modern state of Israel is a secular institution, the fact that it is a mechanism for protecting 6.5 million Jews, nearly 43% of the world's Jewish population, makes its survival and prosperity a vital Jewish imperative. This is true because Judaism is not only a religion. It is not only a set of ideas to which one must subscribe. In fact, attempts to fix Judaism's core beliefs have been vigorously resisted throughout Jewish history. The scholar Moshe Halbertal wrote in his magisterial work on Maimonides that Maimonides' formulation of binding principles of faith, principles that form the basis for membership in the community of Israel and define who has left that community, was a revolutionary step in the history of Jewish thought. The sages never formulated principles of faith. And by the way, some burned Maimonides' books. Jews. When someone comes to me to convert, I explain this basic fact to them, that when the Talmud in Yevamot 47b considers what one should say to a person who wants to convert, the first question that they say should be asked is not one about belief. It's about belonging. The rabbis say, ask, do you not know that Israel at the present time are persecuted, oppressed, despised, harassed, and overcome by afflictions? What a history. In other words, this is hard. Why would you want to do this? And the Talmud continues, if that person replies, I know, and yet I am unworthy, meaning I know, and I still want to do this with all of my heart, that person is immediately accepted. Given some instruction, yes, in the major commandments and the minor commandments about the importance of caring for the poor, by the way, some basic Jewish theology, you're going to be obligated for things that you weren't obligated before, but we are told, do not persuade or dissuade that person too much. If they accept these things, there's circumcision for a man and then off to the mikveh, and when he or she comes up from the mikveh, he or she is deemed to be Jewish in all respects. What is at play here is that from a religious perspective, Jewish identity is not primarily religious. Rabbi David Hartman writes about this in his book, A Heart of Many Rooms. Judaism doesn't begin with Sinai, with a revelation or a leap of faith, but in Egypt. With empathy for a suffering community of slaves. The community of suffering precedes the community that received the Word of God. At Sinai, Pesach as a holiday comes before Shavuot. Pesach is the beginning of the story that makes Sinai possible, he writes. The language of Sinai is heard by a people, by a group of individuals who have become a collective. Sinaitic revelation is unintelligible, he writes, to people who have no sense of history, no sense of empathy for community, no sense of family, I would add no sense of memory. He writes, the biblical roots confession of faith and loyalty to Judaism expresses this very idea, your people shall be my people. And then it says, your God shall be my God. To be a Jew is to bind one's destiny to the destiny of the Jewish people, not in theory, but really. Perhaps one could argue that the state of Israel is not vital to the survival of the Jewish people, but 70 years after the Shoah, when 1/3 of the Jewish people were systematically murdered while the world closed its doors to Jews and did nothing, one may not dismiss the safety of the Jewish people as a hysterical concern, nor may one ignore the reality that the state of Israel is a powerful mechanism for ensuring that nearly half the world's Jews are kept safe by its existence, and that the rest of the world's Jewish population have it as a refuge if, God forbid, such a need were to arise. To ignore Israel on the high holy days, while perhaps less risky for me as a rabbi in the short term, threatens to weaken our community's connection to the Jewish people around the world. Please, please hear me. I am not saying that anyone who disagrees with what I have just described is unwelcome at Beth El, God forbid, or is no longer Jewish, God forbid. As I have said above, Judaism has always resisted efforts to formulate principles of faith to which one must subscribe to be a Jew. Our doors are welcome to all Jews, period. Period. What I'm saying is that as a rabbi, I believe the continued existence of Israel is a religious imperative with which Jews must wrestle, in the way that we must wrestle and respond to other religious imperatives. And so is the suffering of Palestinians living under Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel. More than any other commandment, 36 times the Torah commands us to be careful how we treat the stranger who will live in our midst under our sovereignty in the land of Israel. Because, quote, you know the feelings of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. As the people prepare to enter the land of Israel, Moses tells them that they themselves were slaves in the land of Egypt, something that a few weeks ago someone raised their hand in our Shabbat services and pointed out is historically false. The Jews who Moses was speaking to right before we go into the land, the Torah itself tells us were not there in Egypt. That generation had died out. He is not describing a historical fact. He's making a normative charge to the people because of our historical experience of suffering. The same collective suffering that is so core to Jewish identity. That empathy with that suffering later becomes a condition for converting to Judaism. That same collective suffering has normative power, says to us when we are sovereign in the land, you may not oppress the resident alien, the non-Jew, who has little or no legal power to defend him or herself. Too often, those who express deep concern about the morality of Israel's treatments of Palestinians are accused of being anti-Israel by people who have appointed themselves the guardians of what constitutes pro-Israel discourse in our community. Not only is this not right, it also doesn't work. According to a recent study by the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, and I quote, the tenor of campus debates about Israel and Palestine and the expectations about what others think students should feel and how they should identify often result in student disengagement from both political discourse and from the campus Jewish community. That disengagement of some of our most passionate and committed young Jews helps no one. Expression of concern for Palestinian suffering is not anti-Israel, it is pro-Israel because concern for the stranger in our midst is a deep concern of the Torah itself. Jewish memory is not just Jewish. In his book, Israel, An Echo of Eternity, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in the aftermath of 1967, quote, "We mourn the loss of lives, the devastations, the fruit of violence. We mourn the death of Jews, Christians, Muslims. The screams of anguish are not to be lost to our conscience." And a few days later, at the end of the Six-Day War, Israeli General Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, a pretty good Zionist, said, and I quote, "The joy of our soldiers is incomplete, and their celebrations are marred by sorrow and shock. The men in the front lines were witness not only to the glory of victory, but to the price of victory. Their comrades who fell beside them bleeding the terrible price which our enemies paid touched the hearts of many of our men as well. It may well be that the Jewish people never learned and never accustomed itself to feel the triumph of conquest and victory, and we receive it with mixed feelings. And I want to receive it with mixed feelings. I want to remember the victory and the relief, the sweetness and the salvation of 1967. Because the danger was real. And the horrors of war and the moral complexity that ensued the moment that war ended and continues to this very day. I want to experience Israel fully, not as a caricature, as the caricature that appears on the network news, but as a real place with real people who are struggling to solve really, really complicated problems. I want to remember that Israel is a place where Palestinians suffer. And I want to remember that Israel is an answer to what the world called the Jewish problem or the Jewish question. And I'm not convinced that much of the world still doesn't ask that question. I want to feel gratitude that Israel is a refuge, and I want to remember that Israel is a work unfinished, not a privilege, a challenge to responsibility whose ultimate meaning is, as Heschel writes, in terms of the vision of the prophets, the redemption of all. The religious duty of the Jew is to participate in the process of continuing redemption and seeing that justice prevails over power. That's the Jewish story. I want to be present to my life, but I don't want to merely live in the moment. I can't remember everything. I can't bring my father back. Some of his stories are gone forever. I can no longer go to him to ask what happened before, but the alternative is not to just forget and let go. In his more recent book, Here I Am, Jonathan Safran Foer says all forms of wrestling, arm wrestling, wrestling with faith, have, quote, one thing in common: closeness. You only get to keep what you refuse to let go of. What we don't wrestle, we let go of. Love isn't the absence of struggle. Love is struggle, he writes. To be Jewish is to struggle. to remember, to hold close. In life's richest moments, as you yourself said, we are not alone. We are connected. I am connected to my Father, to what and whom came before, connected to you, connected to Israel, connected to all humanity, and to all that lives. My voice joins in the words of the prayer, V'chol hachayim yoducha Selah. Let all life acknowledge you, Adonai, Selah. This Rosh HaShanah, I wish us a good and sweet year, but not a year of fairy tales and forgetting. I wish us a year of memory. I hope that your lives are noisy and complicated, filled with memories of the past and hopes for the future far beyond the present moment. I hope you are interrupted by people coming to your homes to visit, and I hope you interrupt your life to go and visit others, to visit Israel and make it stronger and more just for all who live in her borders. That, to me, is a good year. That, to me, is a sweet year. And it is what I wish us all. Shana Tova.